Hi guys, welcome back. Today in this lecture I am going to discuss with you The Politics of Literary Postcoloniality, an essay by Aijaz Ahmad published in the year 1995. Now, why is this essay so important? Is because at the peak of postcolonial theory in the 1990s, he stood up to challenge the major postcolonial thinkers. That included Gayatri Spivak, Edward Said and Homi Bhabha. His book In Theory is a major criticism of these theorists as well as Frederick Jameson, who wrote about third world literatures as if third world literature is a homogenized term. So he set out to critique all these thinkers and some of their attitudes, and this essay is a glimpse of it. Before beginning this essay, you must know that Aijaz Ahmad was born in India, but after partition he moved to Pakistan. After finishing his education, he has been a respected faculty member across universities in Canada and the USA. And this essay is appreciated as an intervention in the field of post-colonial theory, as a voice against homogenization of colonized people and their problems and their struggles. As a loyal Marxist critic, Ahmad criticizes these thinkers for ignoring the actual material struggle of people who made the independence of these countries possible, and also to make activism very textual. As you must be knowing that Bhabha earlier said in his book The Location of Culture that textual activism, writing theory and intervention by writing is rather more important than actual activism, actual physical struggle, protests and resistance. Ahmad, being a Marxist, opposes this notion and says that this is not a right attitude. You cannot prefer and privilege textual criticism against actual material conditions. Alright, so he does not like replacement of an activist culture by a textual culture. He blames post-colonial theorists for ignoring the actual material condition of production of knowledge and scholarship. He critiques Bhabha's concepts of ambiguity and ambivalence, which I assume you may be knowing, but if you don't worry, we are going to discuss these concepts within the essay. He of course speaks against the homogenization of post-colonial people and their problems, and he also critiques the manner in which these intellectuals sort of homogenize the post-colonial world, the third world, as if there is no internal difference, there is no regional difference, regional dimensions, there is no multiplicity of meanings or complex origins of these areas or of these positions. All right. Simply stating, Ahmad says that post-colonial world or the third world is not one unified entity. It is comprised of different people, different histories, different financial positions, different sort of ideologies, and we should not homogenize the post-colonial world. With all of these foundational statements and assumptions, we start the essay, the text of it, and I come to page number 1. So let's begin. The Politics of Literary Postcoloniality by Aijaz Ahmad. Let me start by confessing that the current discussions of postcolonialism in the domain of literary theory produce in me a peculiar sense of déjà vu, even a degree of fatigue. There had been in the 1970s in the field of political theory a fulsome debate on the issue of postcolonialism, but with specific reference to the type of postcolonial states that arose in Asia and Africa after post-war decolonizations. Indeed, I had myself published something of a postscript to that debate. Now, as this same term resurfaces in literary theory, without even a trace of memory of that earlier debate, I am reminded of something that Cuban-American critic Roman de la Campa said to me in conversation, to the effect that postcoloniality is postmodernism's wedge to colonize literatures outside Europe and its North American offshoots. which I take the liberty to understand as saying that what used to be known as Third World literature got rechristened as post-colonial literature when the governing theoretical framework shifts from Third World nationalism to postmodernism. The more substantial issues that are involved in the current expositions of what gets called post-colonial criticism, I shall take up presently, but it may be better to enter into the subject through an anecdote. All right, heavy paragraph, lots of difficult words, concepts, but believe me, it's really simple. I'm going to try to simplify it for you very much indeed. Don't mind that. What Ahmad is trying to say here is that the field of post-colonial studies actually started to develop in the 1970s, but not in the literary and critical fields, but in the field of political history and political science. And their focus was how after independence, after decolonization, the new nation states, what was the type of new nation states that were forming? Like what was happening in India as a decolonized space? That was their focus. But in the 1990s, the theory started resurfacing again. All right, in 1994, Bhabha wrote his Location of Culture. All right, so you must remember that. So he says that in 1990s, the theory is arising again, sort of, but it makes no mention of the arguments that took place in the 1970s. And this makes Ahmad feel a little, tired and little sense of, yeah, this has happened before. That's what deja vu is. All right, so this is what happened. So, Ahmad says that there's resurfacing of the same term, post-colonialism, this time in literary theory, but makes no mention of the debates that took place in the 70s. In fact, this time, this modified term is postcoloniality, and this is the term he is going to critique, I've told you already. This term appears as a postmodernist attempt to colonize literatures of the countries outside Europe and North America. All right, by showing the postmodernist tendency of never achieving at a final meaning, what these new theorists are trying to do, that post-colonialism is lost. Now in literary and critical theory, the term is post-coloniality, and it makes sense with the framework of postmodernism and not third world nationalism as it used to be in the 70s. It means, Ahmad thinks, that what used to be known as third world literature, and it was really easy to pin down this is third world literature because it's coming out of third world countries, and third world countries are the countries mainly that were colonized. It was so simple to recognize third world literature. It is now called post-colonial literature, and the governing framework, which in third world literature was third world nationalism, but in post-colonial literature it is postmodernism. So anything can be considered as post-colonial literature because it's postmodernist in sense. So in this essay, Ahmad says he will take up the topic of not only post-colonial literature but also post-colonial criticism. All right. So he starts with an anecdote. Let's read the anecdote. As I moved into a friend's flat for a week's residence in London this past June, I spotted a book on her shelf called Colonial Discourse and Post-Colonial Theory, a Reader. This interested me because I have believed for some time that the term post-coloniality is a late-coming twin of the earlier term colonial discourse. That some others would make so direct and so positive a connection between the two terms was intriguing. So I looked at the table of contents, stopped at section 4 entitled Theorizing Postcoloniality, and that's from where he picked the term and critiqued it. Then I looked up the page number for the first essay in that section entitled What is Postcolonialism? And now postcolonialism had a hyphen within brackets between post and colonialism. As I started reading, I soon came upon this, all in the space of a dozen lines. So he's going to read the passage, but before the passage I must mention what he means to tell you. At a friend's house in London, he catches hold of a book and the title intrigues him. Name of the book was Colonial Discourse and Post-Colonial Theory, a reader. For Ahmad, who thought that post-coloniality is just a recent version of the earlier term colonial discourse, how are these two terms on the title of a book poised as closely as he also thinks they are? Alright, so he opened the book and he stumbled upon a passage that said, now I am going to read the passage. The condemnation of Rushdie by the Islamic post-colonial world raises the interesting questions about the category of the post-colonial itself. For the Islamic post-colonial world, the moral is clear and succinct. To write in the language of the colonizer is to write from within death itself. Post-colonial writers who write in the language of the empire are marked off as traitors to the cause of reconstructive post-colonialism. Post-colonial writers compose, pay attention, under the shadow of death. Look how dramatic they made it sound, and of course Ahmad is not going to like it. Alright, so this seemed to him an extreme exaggeration and slightly misplaced facts. So this passage refers to the satanic verses written by Rushdie, which the book that was banned in India and many other countries, and of course the writer of this book that Ahmad has in his hands treats like it was the Islamic world which was so united in post-colonialism that it because Rushdie used English as a language and English was the reason for the fatwa and for the ban of the book, and that Muslim writers writing in English were writing in a shadow of death. It's highly dramatized. Alright, so this is what the passage says, and now let's see how Ahmad looks closely at this passage and gives you arguments as to why this passage is wrong and misplaced in so many respects. So Ahmad goes on to say, I am reading from the passage. This I thought was odd on several accounts. So he found it odd, no doubt about that. The first is that to ban satanic verses was not a Muslim country but the Indian government, hardly Islamic even in pretension. In turn, English is virtually the official language of India. 40% of all publishing in India is done in English. India publishes more English books than any other country except the US and the UK, and more English speakers are said to reside in India today than in Britain. We might also recall, for the sake of accuracy, that Khomeini's retrograde fatwa declared Rushdie as traitor to Islam and not to some reconstructive post-colonialism. Otherwise, much Islamicist propaganda issues from Tehran in the English language. In Iran, Pakistan, Malaysia and Arab world, millions of people write and generally conduct the business of life in English or French. No one gets killed or otherwise punished for doing so. The claim that post-colonial writers compose under the shadow of death is simply preposterous, whatever the blanket term post-colonial writer might mean. Alright, so you can see the irritation in Ahmad's tone when he says these things. The points that he's making, I'm going to quickly recount. Number one, satanic verses were banned by the Indian government. The Indian government does not pretend to be Muslim or Muslim friendly, even distantly. Alright, so satanic verses were banned not by Muslims but the Indian government. Second, the question of English as the reason for the fatwa or for the book being banned is very silly, because in India and Muslims all over the world, even the Muslim propaganda, for propaganda, English is used extensively for both oral and written purposes. The fatwa in question focused more on Rushdie's betrayal to Islam and not to contribute to some reconstruction of post-colonial unity. The fatwa, the ban had nothing to do with the post-colonial reconstruction of identity, of selfhood. Alright? And English is so widely used even for Islamic propaganda from Middle Eastern Islamic countries that the claim of the fatwa being in response to Rushdie's use of English and the post-colonial writers write under the shadow of death is an extreme exaggeration, if not plain stupid. And by the way, don't miss out on the last line where Ahmad shows his subtle disapproval of the term post-colonial writer. He says that I don't know what that means, post-colonial writer. All right. So by now we've gotten a sense of what Ahmad is going to do in this essay, that he's going to critique how people homogenize the word post-colonial and how most claims that post-colonial critics make are based on slightly misplaced assumptions. Okay, let's move ahead. Ahmad writes, more to the point, when was Islam colonial? In what sense can the regime of Irani clerics be called post-colonial? Was the antecedent Pahlavi regime also post-colonial? Would the Shah have issued a fatwa against Rushdie? What do we gain by suspending profound distinctions between a monarchical autocracy and clerical fascism, so as to denounce an undifferentiated post-colonial Islamic world in the name of the generality of the new marketed category of post-colonial writers? So, what he means by this? He goes on to question why a fatwa that was being issued by an Islamic cleric in Iran is even included as a post-colonial problem. Iran was never colonized. Iranic clerics cannot by any means be called post-colonial. The monarchy, the Pahlavi regime in Iran cannot be called post-colonial. The Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty would not have issued a fatwa against an act like Rushdie's. So why are the distinctions between clerical fascism and monarchical autocracy being erased? Why is there an attempt to create a general state of Islamic post-colonialism? That seems quite forced. It has something to do, Ahmad believes, with, and pay attention, the newly marketed category of post-colonial writers. So, if I may say so, Ahmad is trying to suggest here that it's all a marketing gimmick, a result of the rising capitalism in publishing and distribution. He means that the attempt to group writers within a shared identity which is relevant to the present condition, right, and to connect the related controversies with post-coloniality is an attempt to market the writers, to market the works. You see, the more you dramatize the fatwa and Rushdie and Islam, the more you term controversies as a post-colonial phenomenon, the more people will read Rushdie, the more people will need to read post-colonial criticism, post-colonial theory to analyze Rushdie, and this is how it is all marketed in a capitalist society. So Ahmad, being a Marxist, thinks that this is a marketing, maybe he means that it's a marketing gimmick and nothing more than that. So then Ahmad continues, 4 titles away from this book was another entitled Outside in the Teaching Machine by Gayatri Spivak. Since none of the chapter headings had the word post-colonialism in it, I fastened on the 2 with the word marginality and the term culture studies in them, because post-colonialism was likely to crop up in both. I was glad to have been right, and what interested me in particular was a passage that she quoted on page 60 from an earlier essay of her own, and which again she rewrote for pages 220 to 280 to 81. So by specially mentioning that Spivak had already mentioned this passage somewhere else, and she's mentioning it again in the book, and it has been taken from an earlier essay from her own, it shows how representative this essay is of Spivak's position. And if this passage has something that is problematic, and it is being repeated in several other places, in several other books, in several other essays, or in the same essay again and again, it means that it has certain importance for Spivak, and thus it demands critique if there is some misplaced notion in this passage. So this is the passage I am going to read, and of course you should know that this passage is going to become the basis of the next 2 pages of criticism that Ahmad undertakes of Spivak. The passage says, post-coloniality, the heritage of imperialism in the rest of the globe, is a deconstructive case. As follows, those of us from formerly colonized countries are able to communicate with each other and with the metropolis to exchange and to establish sociality and transnationality because we have had access to the culture of imperialism. Shall we then assign to that culture, in the words of the ethical philosopher Bernard Williams, a measure of moral luck? I think there can be no question that the answer is no. This impossible no to a structure which one critiques yet inhabits intimately is the deconstructive philosophical position, and that everyday here and now of postcoloniality is a case of it. Further, the political claims that are most urgent in decolonized space are tacitly recognized as coded within the legacy of imperialism: nationhood, constitutionality, citizenship, democracy, socialism, even culturalism. They are thus being reclaimed, indeed claimed, as concept metaphors for which no historically adequate referent may be advanced from the postcolonial space. I would really like you to underline the phrase in the first line, the heritage of imperialism. It's very important for us to critique it and to understand how Ahmad critiques it. All right. Then I would like you to underline the word legacy of imperialism in the last fourth line. Legacy of imperialism. And then I would like you to underline nationhood, constitutionality, citizenship, democracy, socialism, culturalism. And in the last line, the phrase, no historically referent may be advanced from post-colonial space. These are the 4 or 5 or a couple of points on which Ahmad is going to critique Spivak and her position. All right. What this passage actually says is that, number 1, Spivak considers that the way countries, post-colonial countries interact with each other, communicate each other, it has been possible only because of the imperial rule that they had. All right. Second, she thinks that the concepts like democracy, nationhood, citizenship, socialism, these all are the legacy of imperialism. They have given it to us, and that is why we can relate to these concepts. Otherwise, there was no historically adequate referent in countries like India. There was no historical existence of these concepts in India. Only the colonial rule gave these concepts to us. So the colonial rule has left a legacy, a heritage, which we are still occupying but also critiquing. This is the gist of this passage, and let's see how Ahmad critiques it. He writes, "What struck me first about this passage is how much at variance Spivak's position is from that of Edward Said. In Said's essay, Third World Intellectuals and Metropolitan Culture, the line of demarcation between the so-called colonial and post-colonial intellectuals was that the colonial ones spoke from positions imbibed from the metropolitan culture, while the post-colonial ones spoke from outside those positions. That argument was unsustainable enough. Now, in Spivak's formulation, post-coloniality itself equals the heritage of imperialism, which the post-colonial critic inhabits deconstructively, or as Bhabha would say, ambivalently." The first thing Ahmad notices about this passage is that Spivak's approach is different from Said's. In Said's essay, Third World Intellectuals and Metropolitan Culture, Said draws the line between colonial and post-colonial intellectuals on the basis of their position. Those who spoke from or on behalf of the metropolis were the colonial ones, and those outside were the post-colonial intellectuals. Ahmad says he did not find even that argument convincing, and now Spivak makes it even more unsustainable. How? In Spivak's terms, post-coloniality is a heritage of imperialism. I told you that this heritage of imperialism phrase is going to repeat itself a number of times, and clearly Ahmad does not approve of it. So he says that in Spivak's terms, post-coloniality is a heritage of imperialism, which the post-colonial critic inhabits ambivalently, without a clearly defined position. He inhabits it, but as well as he critiques it. So without a clearly defined position, it's constructed by a part of both the cultures, the colonized culture and the colonizing culture. That's why it's so ambivalent, all right, and that's what ambivalence means, to sort of occupy, inhabit both cultures, one to which you belong and one which has ruled over you. In her passage, Spivak had stated that the post-colonial intellectuals and citizens are able to establish social bonds and transnational bonds because they had faced the imperial rule. She believes that post-colonialism is a heritage of imperialism, and please do note the positive tone of the words, heritage of imperialism, as if it's a good thing that happened to us. Although she claims it's not good by that moral luck phrase, but we should note the positivity in that phrase. To support this tone, Spivak further mentions that in the post-colonial position, a critic critiques the imperial culture but also deeply inhabits it, because the tools of criticism such as the concepts of nationhood, constitutionality, citizenship, democracy, socialism and even culturalism are an imperial heritage with no historical references in the colonized spaces. So simply speaking, this means that Spivak says that the post-colonial intellectual uses terminology given to us, concepts given to us by imperialism. We use concepts from imperialism to critique imperialism, and that is why this situation is deconstructive and ambivalent. All right. But what problem does Ahmad have with Spivak? Let's read on. The virtue of the passage at any rate is that Spivak does tell us directly what she means by post-coloniality. That's the only virtue in the paragraph. It means, she says, the heritage of imperialism. What is post-coloniality? The heritage of imperialism in the rest of the globe. The word heritage in this context is striking, as if imperialism was a matter of the past. Equally striking is the phrase rest of the globe, which suggests that post-coloniality is a condition found outside the United States, Britain and France. This is curious because my impression is that it is in these countries plus Australia that post-colonial intellectuals actually live and do their theorizing. All this we can let pass, because even more striking is that the legacy of imperialism that Spivak identifies in this defining passage consists almost entirely of political concepts and practices: nationhood, constitutionality, citizenship, democracy, socialism, for which, according to her, no historically adequate referent may be advanced from post-colonial space. This is what Ahmad writes, and now we are going to understand what he means. Ahmad contends that Spivak treats the concept of imperialism as if it's the matter of the past. The first problem is this: she treats imperialism that it has stopped existing, which we clearly know it has not. Second, she defines the source of post-colonial writing, post-colonial criticism, as the areas that are post-colonial and outside the US, France and Britain, which were the main imperial powers. But Ahmad says that most theorists, and it's true that most theorists like Bhabha, Said and Spivak are actually situated in these countries. So how can they call themselves post-colonial when post-colonial is rest of the world apart from the US, Britain and France? So if post-colonial is apart from these countries, how can these critics who are situated in these countries and are doing their theorizing calling themselves post-colonialists, sorry. Alright, so this is another thing. Third is, and the most disconcerting one is this, that Spivak thinks that the concepts of nationhood, constitutionality, citizenship, democracy, socialism, they had no history of existence in colonized countries before the imperial rule. They had no, what Spivak calls, the historically adequate referent in the post-colonial space. This means that in previously colonized countries like India, the concepts of democracy, constitutionality, socialism, etc. had no currency. People did not know about them, they did not exist, they were not practiced. So before colonial domination, of course. So now Ahmad thinks that this is a matter of political history, of which he is an expert, And in this case, he take up India as an example of post-colonial space and will try to prove how Spivak's assertion about these concepts not being present in colonial spaces, colonized spaces before imperial rule is so not true. Now, Ahmad engages in a microscopic analysis of Spivak's statement and tells us that he is going to take up this so-called heritage of imperialism word by word. And he writes, "It is the claim of British colonial historiography that Britain bestowed nationhood on India through conquest and administration. For this colonialist outlook, Indian nationhood is certainly a legacy of imperialism. The fact, however, is that to the extent that India is a nation at all, it became so not through British administration but in the course of the anti-colonial movement, which was internally far more democratic than the colonial state and which mobilized some 20 million peasant households in the struggle against colonialism. The main British contribution to this process was that at the beginning of the Second World War and in response to the Quit India movement, Britain made an irrevocable commitment to Jinnah and thereby contributed to the subsequent partition of the country. The historically adequate referent for Indian nationhood exists in India in the shape of the history of the national movement itself. Similarly, Indian democracy has nothing to do with the heritage of imperialism. As late as 1946, 1 year before independence, franchise has been extended only to a small minority of the population. By contrast, the most important, virtually the only worthwhile political achievement of the modern Indian state is that it became a secular, democratic republic immediately after independence. The Indian state now gives us that secular democracy more in the breach than the observance, but it is still worth recalling that nowhere in Europe or North America was adult franchise implemented with such low levels of literacy and material well-being as in India immediately after independence. Nowhere in Europe or North America did women get the vote in the founding moment of electoral democracy. In India, they did. What Ahmad wants to say is this. If the British colonial historiography claims that the Indian country, the Indian state, enjoys nationhood because the British made that happen by India's conquest and administration, then yes, India is colonial only to that extent. That is our colonial aspect, and that's all. Ahmad asserts that India is a nation because of the struggle to decolonization. Because despite the colonial presence, India struggled to decolonize and made it happen for itself rather than British bestowing something on them. The movement of Indian independence was far more democratic than the British rule, and the movement mobilized some 20 million peasants against colonialism. So, no, the nationhood that India acquired was not a legacy of imperialism. The only legacy that the British gave to India was that of a painful and unforgettable partition that was the result of their politics. The struggle for nationhood outside and despite colonial rule, not because of it, is the historically adequate reference Spivak thinks India did not have. Coming to democracy, similarly, it cannot be said that there is no historically adequate referent for democracy in India outside the colonial rule. Ahmad reminds us that in 1946, when the British were still here and we were sort of under the British rule, which was 1 year before independence, the right to vote was assigned only to a small minority of the population. But immediately after independence, the right to vote was given to each and every person living in India without any disparity in class, gender, caste. Ahmad says that becoming a secular democratic state immediately after independence might be the only commendable achievement of the modern Indian state. They respected it later or not, they honored the commitment later with the Muslims or not, but at least they went ahead and gave the right to vote to each and every citizen of the country. Ahmad adds that nowhere in Europe or North America, which were the main powers, did the adult franchise or the right to vote was extended to people with such low literacy or financial well-being. Nowhere in the world did women get the right to vote at the founding moment of democracy, but in India they actually did. So again, no. Democracy is not something that you gave to us. You gave to us democracy on a very small scale. We are the ones who created democracy after independence for ourselves. So saying that it is a legacy of imperialism is completely wrong. Ahmad continues, and I am reading from the text. The same applies to citizenship, which exists only to the extent that the people in their collectivity are able to give laws unto themselves. No one can be a citizen of a colonial state, and citizenship itself cannot be so-called heritage of imperialism. The precise aim of the anti-colonial movement in India was to institute citizenship and to put in place a constitutionality that was derived not from colonial authority but from a constituent assembly. None of it amounts to a heritage of imperialism. Even so, not the least remarkable of Spivak's assertions is, of course, that there is no historically adequate referent for socialism in India. It would surely be news to those many millions of Indians who have punctually voted for the communist tickets over almost half a century if they were to be told that they are mere progeny of Lord Mountbatten. The historically adequate referent for socialism in India, I should have thought, was the same as anywhere else, namely the development of capitalism and the consequent division of society into classes of the modern type. So now Ahmad moves on to tell us how constitutionality or citizenship was also not a legacy of imperialism. He says, and I'm simplifying the passage for you, the right to attain citizenship was given to Indians by Indians themselves after independence through the Constituent Assembly that was democratically chosen. One cannot attain citizenship in a colonial state. In a colonial rule, we are all sort of colonized and natives and sort of slaves and not independent beings and independent citizens of a democratic state. So the concept of citizenship may also be stated as not a legacy of imperial rule, but the result of the struggle of so many Indians against the colonial powers. And the most disturbing part of Spivak's passage that Ahmad just cannot agree with, because he's a Marxist, is the fact that she thinks there's no historically adequate referent in India for socialism. He thinks that, like in everywhere else in the world, socialism developed when capitalism developed. The advent of socialism coincides with the advent of capitalism and the advent of the class structure that came along with it. So socialism developed at its own pace and cannot be attributed to the heritage of imperialism per se. Ahmad jibes at Spivak when he says that the millions of Indians who have so loyally voted for the communist leaders of India for half a century would be so shocked to know that they have been termed as mere progeny of Lord Mountbatten. He continues to write, and I am reading, the point could perhaps be made that in describing them as the heritage of imperialism, Professor Spivak is referring here simply to the European origin of these words, concepts and practices. This too would be strange. Words may have originated in Europe, but the historical adequacy of the referent can only be established through reference to practices undertaken within India by Indian political subjects. Even with regards to concepts, I did not know that mere origins or myths of origins mattered all that much in postmodern discourse, nor does it seem appropriate that everything that originates in Europe should be consigned so unilaterally to the heritage of imperialism unless we subscribe to an essentialist notion of an undifferentiated Europe where everything and everyone is imperialist. In stressing this matter of origins and in declaring that there is no historically adequate referent for democracy and socialism in India, Spivak is treading on very dangerous ground, unwittingly repeating what the Indian right wing says all the time. There's a powerful political movement in India which says that Indian Muslims and Christians are not true Indians because they subscribe to religions that did not originate in India, that Indian socialists are not true Indians because Marxism originated in Europe, that the Indian state should not be secular state because secularism is a Western construct. There are influential social scientists who argue that parliamentary democracy does not suit Indian conditions and that India should invent indigenous social sciences and indigenous political forms. In conceding that democracy, socialism and constitutionality are the heritage of imperialism, Spivak concedes, I think, far too much.
The right thing to do. He says that since the terms may have developed in the West, but the historically adequate referent may only be assigned to the practices in India by Indian citizens. The terms have to be adopted in the Indian context, practiced by Indian citizens in the Indian context. Alright, only then they will be historically adequate for India. So, even if they originated in the West, unless and until India doesn't follow them, they will not have an historically adequate referent. But since India was following these concepts, there was democracy, there was constitutionality, there is socialism, there is nationhood. So, India of course has the historically adequate referent without a colonial rule, without the legacy of imperialism. Also, Ahmad disregards the tendency to use the practice of tracing origin of concepts to their roots. He says that in the postmodern condition, which means that the meaning of words, of concepts is never fixed. So, there is no point in tracing the roots of certain terms. The words originated in Europe does not mean that it becomes an imperial legacy. Is everything related to Europe imperial? Are all Europeans colonial rulers or people who dominate others? Everything that develops in Europe is not imperial, as all the people that live in Britain are not colonizers and imperial agents. It would be an essentialism if we think in that manner. So, he believes that Spivak's reliance on the origin of concepts theory may be quite dangerous because it is a similar attitude that the Indian right wing has. It claims that Indian Muslims and Christians are not actual Indians because their religion did not originate in India. They say that Indian socialists are not true Indians because Marx was a European and Marxism developed in Europe. They say that Indian state should not be secular because secularism originated in the West. Some people go as far as to say that the system of democracy is not so well suited for India and India should have some other indigenous system of administration of government. Alright, so one should not rely so much on the origin of terms practice. That can lead us to dangerous horizons. Now, let's end this lecture with a quick revision. Number 1, Ahmad says postcoloniality is powered by postmodernism and not third world nationalism, and how that has its own problems. Second, he says that there's an attempt, and he shows us that there's an attempt to regroup intellectuals as post-colonial and whatever happens with them as a post-colonial phenomena, which is also a misplaced assumption. Number 3, he takes up a passage from Spivak's book and he critiques the term post-coloniality, and he also critiques Spivak's assertion that concepts like democracy, citizenship, nationhood and socialism, since they did not originate in India, are a legacy of imperialism. Ahmad demonstrates how that is not so well founded. Alright. So, these are the things that we covered in this lecture. In the next 3 parts, we are going to cover the rest of the lecture. I hope you understood it. If you found it helpful, please consider subscribing and liking the video. Thanks a lot. Have a nice day.